The air at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada always tasted of dust and jet fuel. It was a place of immense power, of sleek, billion-dollar aircraft that could touch the edge of space. And then there was Captain Eva Rostova's plane. She called it the Beast. Everyone else called it the Warthog. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was not sleek or beautiful. It was a flying tank, a stubborn, ugly machine built around a cannon the size of a small car. To the other pilots, the hotshots in their needle-nosed F-16s and F-35s, the A-10 was a relic, a piece of history that belonged in a museum. And by extension, so did its pilot. Eva felt their eyes on her in the briefing room. It was a familiar feeling, a mix of curiosity and pity, with a heavy dose of condescension. She was small in her flight suit, with a quiet intensity that most of the men mistook for shyness or fear. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was usually set in a neutral expression that gave nothing away. She didn't join in the loud jokes or the backslapping bravado that filled the room before a mission briefing. She simply sat, listened, and absorbed every detail. Her silence was a wall, built brick by brick over years of having to be twice as good to get half the credit. It was a wall that had started with her father. Lieutenant Colonel Rostova had been a brilliant pilot, a man who could make any aircraft dance. But his career had ended in disgrace, a mission gone wrong, a scapegoat needed. The official report cited pilot error. The whispers in the halls of the Pentagon said he was pushed to fly a mission with faulty intelligence by a commander who needed a victory. Any victory. Eva grew up in the shadow of that failure, carrying the weight of a name that was once respected, and then became a cautionary tale. She joined the Air Force not just to fly, but to redeem that name, to prove that a Rostova was not a failure. "All right, settle down," Colonel Hayes said from the front of the room. The chatter died down. On the main screen, a satellite image of a rugged mountainous region appeared. "This is Operation Serpent's Coil. We have a Green Beret team, call sign Nomad, that needs to go into this valley and destroy a high-value enemy communications hub." The room was still. This was the real thing, not a training exercise. "The terrain is treacherous," Hayes continued, zooming in on a deep, winding canyon. "The enemy is well entrenched. We're going to be providing top cover. Major Davison, you and your Vipers will be primary." Major Kent Bulldog Davison flashed a confident grin. He was everything Eva was not, loud, charismatic, and universally loved by command. He was the face of the modern Air Force, the pilot they put on recruitment posters. He stood up, radiating confidence. "We'll keep the sky clean for them, Colonel." "No problem." "Good," Hayes said. He then glanced over at Eva, almost as an afterthought. "Captain Rostova, you'll be on standby. Your A-10 will fly a holding pattern over Sector Gamma, well clear of the hot zone. You are to engage only if called upon by me, and only as a last resort. Is that clear?" The words were a slap in the face. A last resort. A token assignment to keep her busy while the real pilots did the real work. A few of the F-16 pilots exchanged smirks. Eva's face remained impassive. She simply nodded. "Crystal clear, Colonel." The briefing ended, and the pilots began to file out, their talk already turning to flight plans and weapon loadouts. As Eva gathered her notes, Davison walked over, clapping her on the shoulder with a little too much force. "Don't you worry, Valkyrie," he said, using her call sign with a mocking edge. "We'll handle the real work. You just keep your old pig warm for the air show. Wouldn't want her to get cold." Eva looked up at him. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, met his. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. There was a cold fire in her gaze that made his smile falter for just a fraction of a second. She simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there. She didn't go to the mess hall or the pilot's lounge. She went to the one place she felt at home, the hangar. The vast, echoing space was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system. And there, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, was her A-10. It wasn't pretty. Its engines were mounted high on the fuselage, its wings were straight and thick, and its nose was blunt to accommodate the massive cannon. It was covered in grease stains and patches, every scar telling a story. "Heard the news, Captain," a gruff voice said from the shadows. Master Sergeant Frank Miller, her crew chief, emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a man who seemed to be made of spare parts and hydraulic fluid, with a face like a road map of every conflict since the 1990s. He had been her father's crew chief, too. He was the only one on the base who knew the whole story. "They've got me flying circles in the desert while Bulldog gets to play hero," Eva said, her voice flat. She ran a hand along the fuselage of her plane. The metal was cool and familiar. "Let 'em," Miller said, leaning against the landing gear. "Pride comes before the fall, Captain. That man, Davison, he's all flash. He cares more about how he looks on the gun camera footage than he does about the mission. You care about the guys on the ground. That's why you fly this beast." He patted the plane's nose. "These other pilots, they don't get it. They think war is a video game you win from 30,000 feet. But war is ugly. It's dirty. It happens down in the mud. This plane was built for the mud. It's got a soul. And it's got your back. Don't you ever forget that." Eva looked from the old sergeant to the old plane. They were her only allies here. She spent the next few hours with Miller, going over every inch of the A-10. She checked the hydraulic lines, inspected the cannon's feed system, and polished the canopy herself. It was a ritual, a way of connecting with the machine, of steadying her own nerves. As she worked, she couldn't shake a bad feeling about the mission. She had studied the topographical maps for hours. The valley was a death trap. The walls were sheer, creating natural funnels that would make any ground force vulnerable. And for air support, it was a nightmare. A fast-moving jet like an F-16 would have only seconds to acquire a target and fire before needing to pull up sharply to avoid the canyon walls. They would be ineffective, a fly buzzing over a spider's web. The A-10, on the other hand, was made for places like this. It could fly low and slow, loitering over the battlefield, picking targets apart with terrifying precision. It could take a beating and keep flying. It was the right tool for the job, and it had been left in the toolbox. Later that night, as the final preparations were being made, Eva sat alone in her small, sterile room. She thought of her father, of the shame that had haunted him until his dying day. He had followed his orders, and it had destroyed him. She looked at herself in the mirror. The same clear blue eyes stared back at her, but hers held a different kind of fire. It was not the fire of ambition, but the cold, hard flame of resolve. She would follow her orders, too. But she would be ready. And if the call came, if that one-in-a-million chance arose where a last resort was needed, she and her warthog would show them all what a relic could do. The morning of Operation Serpent's Coil dawned clear and hot. The base was a hive of activity, but the energy was focused on one place, the flight line where Major Davison's F-16s were being armed. Ground crews swarmed around the sleek jets, loading them with smart bombs and air-to-air missiles. Media personnel, cleared for a pre-mission story, snapped photos of Davison as he confidently briefed his wingmen, his white helmet tucked under his arm. He was the star of the show. Eva was pointedly ignored. Her own pre-flight checks were a quiet, solitary affair, conducted in the relative silence of her hangar with only Master Sergeant Miller for company. The weapon loadout they had assigned, her was standard, almost generic. It was the kind of ordnance you carried on a routine patrol, not for a high-stakes close air support mission. The message was clear. You will not be needed. Her unease about the mission plan had grown overnight. After leaving the hangar, she had spent hours in the flight simulator, running every possible scenario through the valley. Every time, the result was the same. The F-16s were too fast. The engagement window was too small. The risk of hitting the friendly forces on the ground was dangerously high. She knew she had to say something. It wasn't about pride or wanting in on the action. It was about the lives of the soldiers who were about to walk into that canyon. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the command center, her simulated flight data loaded onto a tablet. She found Colonel Hayes in the bustling operations room, surrounded by a dozen other officers, all focused on the large tactical displays. Major Davison was there, leaning over the console, pointing out his planned ingress and egress routes. "Colonel Hayes, sir," Eva said, her voice steady but quiet. Hayes looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Captain?" "Sir, I have some concerns about the air support plan for the valley. I've run simulations, and the topography presents a significant risk for high-speed strafing runs. There are multiple blind spots and a high probability of collateral damage." Davison turned, a condescending smirk on his face. "Captain Rostova is worried our multi-million-dollar jets can't handle a little canyon, Colonel. She thinks her flying tractor would do a better job." A few officers chuckled. Hayes's expression hardened. He was a man who trusted pedigree and reputation, and Davison had both. Eva was an unknown quantity with a tarnished family name. "Your concerns are noted, Captain," Hayes said dismissively, turning his attention back to the map. "Major Davison is one of the best pilots in the Air Force. I'm confident he can handle it. Now I suggest you get to your aircraft. You have your own assignment to focus on." "But sir," Eva persisted, holding up the tablet, "the data is clear. The A-10's lower stall speed and tighter turning radius are specifically suited for this kind of environment. I can provide more effective and safer support." Davison stepped between her and the colonel. "What you can do, Captain, is get out of the way of the people who are actually running this mission. Your job is to fly in a circle and stay out of trouble. Do you think you can manage that?" The insult hung in the air. Eva felt the familiar heat of anger and frustration rise in her chest, but she forced it down. She looked past Davison to the colonel, whose face was a mask of impatience. She had lost. No one was listening. "Yes, Major," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I can manage that." She turned and walked out of the command center, the sound of their confident planning fading behind her. She felt defeated, but more than that, she felt a cold dread for the men of Nomad Team. They were walking into a trap, and the people in charge of protecting them were blinded by arrogance. She found Miller waiting by her plane, a thermos of black coffee in his hand. He didn't need to ask how it went. He could see it on her face. "They wouldn't listen," Eva said, taking the cup he offered. The hot liquid did little to warm the chill inside her. Miller leaned against the A-10's massive front tire. "Let me tell you a story, Captain. Back in the early days of the sandbox, I knew a crew chief for an A-1 Skyraider. Big old propeller. Plane. The jet jockeys made fun of it all the time. Called it the Spad. One day, a platoon of Rangers got pinned down in a city, surrounded, running out of ammo. The Phantoms and the Starfighters were flying overhead, dropping bombs half a mile away because they couldn't get low enough to see who was who." He took a sip of his own coffee. "Then this old Spad comes chugging along, flew right down the street, weaving between the buildings. The pilot could see the enemy in the windows. He stayed there for 2 hours, taking hits, his plane getting shot to pieces, but he laid down fire with his cannons and saved every single one of those Rangers. Don't you ever let them tell you that you or that plane don't belong," he said, tapping the A-10's armored nose. "This plane was built for ugly work down in the dirt. It was built for days like this." His words settled in Eva's mind, a small point of light in her growing anxiety. She finished her pre-flight checks, her movements precise and automatic. As she climbed into the cockpit, she felt the familiar sense of becoming one with the machine. This was her sanctuary, the one place where she was in complete control. The mission began exactly on schedule. Eva took off first, her A-10 lumbering into the sky, feeling heavy and powerful. She banked towards her assigned sector, a lonely patch of desert miles away from the action. Soon after, Davison's F-16s screamed past her, their afterburners, leaving fiery trails in the morning sky as they raced towards the mountains. Through her comms, she listened to the mission unfold. The C-130 transport plane dropped the Nomad team at their insertion point. The radio chatter was calm, professional. "Nomad is on the ground," came the voice of Captain Jake "Nomad" Riley, the team leader. "Moving towards the objective." "Roger that, Nomad," Davison's smooth voice replied from high above. "Bulldog flight is overhead. The sky is clear. Have a nice walk." For the next hour, Ava flew her slow, lazy circles. The sun beat down on her canopy. The desert stretched out below her, empty and silent. She was a spectator, a forgotten piece on the chessboard. She monitored the command frequency, listening to the routine check-ins. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then the tone changed. "Command, this is Nomad," Captain Riley's voice said, suddenly tense. "We're seeing more movement than the intel suggested. A lot more." A pause. Then, the unmistakable sound of gunfire erupted in the background of his transmission. "Contact! We have contact! We're being engaged from the ridges on all sides. It's an ambush! A damn ambush!" The frequency exploded into a cacophony of shouts and weapons fire. "Bulldog, this is Nomad! We are pinned down, taking heavy fire from fortified positions. We need immediate air support. I repeat, immediate support!" Eva's hands tightened on the control stick. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment she had dreaded. Davison's voice came back, but the easy confidence was gone, replaced by a strained, high-altitude detachment. "Nomad, this is Bulldog. We're trying to get a visual. There's too much smoke, and the valley walls are too steep. We can't get a clean shot without endangering your position. We can't risk a low pass." A desperate voice from the ground team cut in. "You have to. They're all over us. They're bringing in mortars." The line went quiet for a moment, filled only with the terrifying sounds of a one-sided battle. Then Riley's voice, strained with disbelief and fury, came over the radio. "What do you mean you can't risk it? We're getting cut to pieces down here." Ava listened, her blood running cold. She looked at her map, at the coordinates of the firefight. Then she looked at her fuel gauge. She was closer than anyone. She was the only one who could help, but her orders were clear. Stay in her sector. Wait for the call. A call that she knew, with sickening certainty, would never come. The command center at Creech had transformed from a place of confident oversight into a pressure cooker of controlled panic. Colonel Hayes stood frozen, his eyes locked on the tactical display where the friendly icons of Nomad team were clustered. Together, surrounded by a rapidly growing sea of red enemy symbols. Every crackle of gunfire that came over the speakers was like a physical blow. The mission wasn't just failing, it was turning into a massacre. High above the valley, Major Davison's voice was a frustratingly calm counterpoint to the chaos on the ground. "Command, Bulldog flight is holding at 20,000 feet. I still have no clear line of sight on enemy positions. The hostiles are dug in right on top of Nomad's location. Any ordnance I drop would be danger close. I can't engage. The risk of friendly fire is too high." On the ground, Captain Riley's men were fighting for their lives. Their return fire was becoming sporadic. They were conserving ammunition. They were losing. "They're flanking us from the west," a voice screamed over the comms, followed by a grunt of pain. "Command, this is Bulldog," Davison said again, his voice now carrying a tone of finality. "This position is untenable. I recommend we cut our losses. We need to pull the plug on this operation and arrange for search and rescue. We have to call the mission a loss." A loss. The words echoed in the silent command center. A loss meant leaving those men to die. Colonel Hayes's face was pale, his jaw clenched. He had trusted Davison. He had trusted the plan. And now he was listening to the end of a dozen good men. Miles away, flying her lonely circle in the sky, Captain Ava Rostova heard every word. She listened to the desperate pleas from the ground, the detached excuses from the air. and the damning silence from command. Everything she had feared had come to pass. The plan had failed. The fast jets were useless. The men of Nomad Team had been written off. She looked at her console. Her orders were to remain in Sector Gamma. Disobeying a direct order in a combat situation was career suicide. It meant a court-martial, prison, and the final, absolute disgrace of the Rostova name. Her father had followed orders, and it had destroyed him. She was being told to follow hers, to fly in safe circles while men died just over the horizon. In that moment, something inside her broke. It wasn't her discipline or her training. It was the part of her that had accepted being underestimated. The part that had silently endured the insults and the condescension. She thought of Master Sergeant Miller's words. This plane was built for ugly work down in the dirt. The dirt was where those men were. And that's where she needed to be. Her hands moved with a purpose she hadn't felt all day. She banked, the A-10, turning its ugly nose away from her designated patrol route and directly towards the mountains. She switched her radio to the command frequency, her thumb hovering over the transmit button. Her heart was a cold, steady drum in her chest. This was it, the point of no return. She keyed the mic, her voice cutting through the chaos with chilling calm. Command, this is Valkyrie 1. I have a solution. I'm heading to Nomad's position. The response from Colonel Hayes was instantaneous. His voice a furious roar. Valkyrie 1, you will stand down. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. You will return to your patrol route immediately. Davison's voice, laced with disbelief, cut in. What the hell does she think she's doing? She's going to get herself and everyone else killed. Command, order her to disengage. Eva ignored them. This was no longer about them, or their orders, or their pride. It was about the men in the valley. She reached down and switched her primary radio off the command frequency, severing her link to Hayes and Davison. The only channel she left open was the one connected directly to the ground team. The cockpit was suddenly quiet, free from the shouting and the recriminations. She keyed the mic again. Nomad, this is Valkyrie 1. I'm on my way. Talk to me. Where do you need me? For a few seconds, there was only the sound of gunfire on the other end. Then a voice, filled with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a tiny spark of hope, came back. It was Captain Riley. Valkyrie? Your call sign is not on our support roster. They called it off. They told us it was a lost mission. Ava's gaze was fixed on the rapidly approaching mountain range. Her voice was as steady as the hand on her control stick. I didn't get that memo, Nomad. I'm 5 minutes out. Put some paint on the targets for me. I'm coming in hot. Paint on the targets? Riley repeated, the hope in his voice growing. You can actually engage? That's the idea, Captain, Eva replied. Light 'em up for me. All right. All right. Riley's voice was suddenly energized, shouting orders to his men. You heard her! Get the IR marker on that heavy machine gun nest on the North Ridge. Now! Back in the command center, they could only watch in stunned disbelief. Eva's icon on the tactical display had broken from its holding pattern and was now making a straight line for the valley. She wasn't responding to their calls. She was a ghost, a rogue element in their perfectly failed plan. She's gone insane, Davison muttered, his voice audible over an open channel. Colonel Hayes just stared at the screen, his face ashen. He had given a direct order. She had defied it. He was witnessing the end of a career and quite possibly the end of a life. But as he watched her icon speed towards that valley of death, a place his best pilot with his best jets refused to go, he felt a sliver of something he hadn't felt in an hour. A desperate, irrational flicker of hope. Eva pushed the throttle forward. The A-10's twin engines roared in response. The beast was slow, but it was relentless. It wasn't built for speed. It was built for a fight, and she was flying it straight into the heart of one. The sun glinted off her canopy as she descended, a lone symbol of defiance heading straight into a lost cause. The valley waited, ready to swallow her whole. The world outside Eva's cockpit became a blur of rock and sky. She pushed the A-10 into a steep dive, the ground rushing up to meet her. The valley opened up like a jagged wound in the earth, filled with smoke, fire, and the sounds of battle. Her systems screamed warnings at her, terrain proximity, enemy radar locks, but she ignored them. Her focus narrowed to the instruments on her dash and the small patch of hell visible through her canopy. On the ground, Captain Jake Riley and the surviving members of Nomad Team were huddled behind a crumbling rock formation, making their last stand. Ammunition was critically low. 2 of his men were down, and another was bleeding badly. They had heard the female pilot's voice, a ghost on the radio, but they didn't dare to hope. They had been promised air support before. Then they heard it. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of an F-16 passing miles overhead. This was a new sound, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. It grew louder, a menacing hum that vibrated in their chests. "What is that?" one of his men asked, peering over the rocks. Riley looked up, and then he saw it. Bursting through a plume of black smoke, flying so low it seemed to be scraping the canyon floor, was the ugliest, most beautiful airplane he had ever seen. The A-10 Warthog, with its strange shape and engines mounted on its back, looked like some prehistoric beast of prey. It was not flying over the battle. It was in it. Valkyrie Nomad. "We've got an IR mark on a heavy gunner's nest, North Ridge," Riley yelled into his radio, his voice filled with awe. "Roger, Nomad." "I see it," Eva's calm voice replied. "Rolling in." From Eva's perspective, the world tilted sideways. She banked the A-10 hard, the G-forces pushing her deep into her seat. The infrared marker on the ridge glowed brightly in her heads-up display. She lined up the shot, her thumb moving to the trigger on her control stick. The enemy position opened up on her, tracer rounds zipping past her canopy like angry red hornets. The plane shuddered as a few rounds found their mark, but the titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit held firm. She was inside the safest, part of the toughest plane in the sky. She squeezed the trigger. The cannon, the GAU-8 Avenger, was the heart of the A-10. When it fired, the entire aircraft seemed to shudder. It didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like the fabric of reality, being torn apart. A torrent of 30mm armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each the size of a milk bottle, spewed from the nose of the plane at a rate of 70 per second. On the ground, the men of Nomad Team watched in stunned silence. A stream of fire erupted from the front of the A-10, connecting the plane to the enemy machine gun nest. The ridge didn't just explode, it was erased. Rock, sand, and the enemy position were pulverized into a cloud of dust and debris. The deafening chatter of the enemy machine gun went silent. "Good hit! Good hit!" Riley screamed into the radio. "Valkyrie, you are a sight for sore eyes. We have enemy mortars on the eastern slope behind the rock slide. On it, Nomad!" Eva replied, her voice still unnervingly calm. She pulled the A-10 into a steep, climbing turn that a sleeker jet could never have managed at that low altitude. She came around for another pass, the Warthog seeming to dance between the canyon walls. Back at Creech, the command center was silent. The tactical display showed what was happening. They couldn't see the action, but they could hear it. They heard Eva's calm professionalism, Riley's increasingly hopeful directions, and in the background, the terrifying roar of the A-10's cannon. Major Davison stood motionless, his face a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. This was the pilot he had mocked. In the plane he had called a relic, doing a job he had declared impossible. For the next 20 minutes, Eva and the soldiers on the ground worked in perfect harmony. She became an extension of their will, a hammer. They wielded against the enemy. "Valkyrie, enemy technical moving up the wash, south of our position. Roger. Firing rockets. A pod of Hydra rockets shot from beneath the A-10's wing, turning the enemy vehicle into a fireball. They're trying to flank us again from the west cave mouth. I see them. Cannon is up. The brrr-tee of the gun echoed through the valley once more, and the flanking maneuver was brutally shut down. Eva was in a trance. It was just her, the plane, and the voices of the men she was protecting. She flew with an instinctual grace, making the heavy A-10 perform feats of agility it was never designed for. The plane took more hits. Warning lights flashed all over her console. One engine was sputtering, and the hydraulics felt sluggish. But the beast kept flying. It absorbed the punishment, protected its pilot, and continued to fight. Finally, the enemy fire began to slacken. The ambush was broken. The overwhelming force that had surrounded Nomad Team had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by one pilot in one old airplane. A silence fell over the valley, broken only by the whistling of the wind and the crackle of burning vehicles. Captain Riley, his uniform torn and his face covered in grime, keyed his radio. His voice was thick with exhaustion and raw emotion. "Valkyrie, I don't know who you are or how you got here, but you just saved us all. The valley is secure. I repeat, the valley is secure for Nomad Team." Eva took a deep, shuddering breath, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a profound weariness. She looked at her fuel gauge. The needle was deep in the red. "Glad to hear it, Nomad," she said, her voice strained for the first time. She switched her radio back to the command frequency. "Command, this is Valkyrie 1. The ground team is safe. I am bingo fuel and taking heavy damage. I'm turning for home." On the tactical display in the command center, her icon, which had been a whirlwind of activity in the valley, turned and began to crawl slowly back towards the base. A long list of system failures and critical warnings trailed behind it on the screen. She had won the battle. But now, a new one began. The long, lonely flight home in a crippled machine. The question hung heavy and unspoken in the silent room. Would she make it back? The atmosphere at Creech Air Force Base was thick with tension. Every available emergency vehicle was scrambled, lining the main runway in a grim parade of flashing lights. Word had spread like wildfire. Captain Rostova, the quiet pilot with the old plane, had single-handedly saved the ambushed Special Forces team after defying a direct order to stand down. Now, she was trying to bring her battered aircraft home. Master Sergeant Frank Miller stood at the edge of the tarmac, his arms crossed, his face a stone mask that couldn't quite hide the worry in his eyes. Not far from him, a silent group of pilots had gathered. Major Davison was among them, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a sullen, unreadable expression. He watched the horizon, waiting. A speck appeared in the distance. As it grew closer, the full extent of the damage became visible. The A-10, Valkyrie 1, was a wreck. One engine was trailing a thick plume of black smoke. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes, and a large section of the tail was shredded. It was flying unevenly, limping through the air. "She's not going to make it," one of the younger pilots whispered. "Shut up," Miller growled without looking at him. "She'll make it." Eva's voice, strained but controlled, came over the tower radio. "Creech Tower, this is Valkyrie 1. I have an engine fire and a partial hydraulic failure. My landing gear is unresponsive, requesting permission for a belly landing." The tower cleared the runway. Eva brought the crippled warthog in low and steady. It touched the tarmac not with its wheels, but with its armored belly, sending a shower of sparks flying for hundreds of feet as it screeched down the runway. It was a violent, ugly landing, but it was a successful one. The plane skidded to a halt, and the fire crews immediately descended on it, dousing the smoking engine in foam. The canopy opened, and a figure in a flight suit slowly climbed out. Eva stood on the wing for a moment, looking at the assembled crowd. Then she slid to the ground, her legs unsteady beneath her. Miller was the first one to reach her. He didn't say a word. He just put a firm hand on her shoulder, his grip conveying all the pride and relief he felt. Just then, Colonel Hayes and Major Davison approached, their faces grim. Hayes looked from Eva to the ruined plane, then back to Eva. He opened his mouth, the regulations and the charges of insubordination no doubt on the tip of his tongue. But before he could speak, the thumping sound of helicopter blades filled the air. A Black Hawk swooped in and landed nearby. The side door slid open, and the surviving members of Nomad Team emerged. Many were walking wounded, covered in bandages and dirt, but they were alive. Their leader, Captain Jake Riley, his arm, in a sling, strode directly past the colonel and Major Davison. He stopped directly in front of Eva. He raised his good arm in a sharp, formal salute. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice clear and loud enough for everyone to hear. "My men and I are alive because of you. You flew through hell for us, when everyone else wrote us off as a loss. Whatever happens here, whatever the regulations say, know that you have the undying gratitude of every man on this team." One by one, the other Green Berets, some leaning on their comrades for support, lined up and rendered a salute. It was a powerful, silent testament that drowned out any reprimand the colonel could have possibly delivered. A formal inquiry was unavoidable. Davison, trying to save his own career, testified against Eva. He painted her as a reckless, glory-seeking pilot who had ignored orders and endangered the entire operation. He presented his decision to hold back as a prudent choice, to avoid friendly fire, the correct call by a seasoned commander. But Master Sergeant Miller had not been idle. He had a deep distrust for pilots like Davison, and he had done some digging. He presented the inquiry board with maintenance logs from the day of the mission. They showed that Major Davison had insisted on equipping his F-16 with a new high-resolution targeting pod. On paper, it was an upgrade, but Miller also presented the pod's technical specifications, which clearly stated it was unreliable in dusty, low-altitude environments with steep terrain, the exact conditions of the valley. It was, however, excellent for capturing crystal-clear gun camera footage from high altitude, the kind of footage that looked great in debriefs and won pilots' awards. Furthermore, Miller produced the initial mission plan Eva had submitted, the one where she had flagged the valley as a high-risk zone for fast jets, and he had a signed statement from a junior officer in the command center who confirmed that Davison had personally dismissed Eva's concerns as the whining of a pilot. With an inferiority complex, the narrative flipped. Davison hadn't been prudent. He had been vain. He had chosen the wrong equipment for the mission because it made him look better. He had ignored a valid warning from a fellow pilot because his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that an older, inferior plane might be better suited for the job. He hadn't called the mission a loss to save lives. He had called it a loss to cover for his own inability to complete it. The board cleared Eva of all charges. More than that, they recommended her for the Distinguished Flying Cross for her heroism and decisive action. The final report stated that her willingness to defy an unlawful order, an order that would have resulted in the deaths of the entire ground team, was the highest form of duty. Davison was grounded indefinitely, stripped of his command, and faced a court-martial for dereliction of duty. But the biggest revelation came weeks later. The high-profile nature of the inquiry had prompted a review of other missions where intelligence failures had been blamed on pilot error. One of those cases was that of Eva's father. Investigators discovered that Lieutenant Colonel Rostova had also raised concerns about faulty intelligence before his fateful mission and had been overruled by a commander obsessed with his own reputation. The same pattern of pride and scapegoating. Her father's name was posthumously cleared, his honor fully restored. Months later, Eva was back in the hangar standing beside her fully repaired A-10. The beast was scarred but strong, just like its pilot. A group of new young pilots was gathered around her, listening with rapt attention as she explained the intricacies of the plane's cannon. She was no longer an outsider. She was a legend, a teacher. Captain Riley walked into the hangar. He told her the news about her father. For the first time, Ava's stoic composure broke. A single tear traced a clean path through the grease on her cheek. She looked at the old warthog, the machine that had carried her through the fire. She looked at the faces of the young pilots who saw her not as a relic, but as a hero. She had not only saved a dozen men, she had redeemed her family's name and rewritten her own story. And as she looked at Riley and offered a small, genuine, hard-won smile, she knew her father could finally rest in peace.